It is an immense pleasure to welcome Bettany Hughes here for the pre-performance event. She needs absolutely no introduction from me. I need only say that she is an immense friend not only of the classics but also of King's College, has done many wonderful things for us. This is just the latest in the sequence. She is superbly well qualified to talk on this occasion about Euripides' Helen, because not only has she published an immense and splendid book on Helen, but also an equally immense and equally splendid book on Socrates and 5th century Athens, which contains one of those marvellous evocations of what it must have been like for the Athenians to live through, particularly the traumatic years of the Peloponnesian War, precisely when the Helen was performed. We have about 40 minutes. We propose to begin with a conversation just between the two of us, but after a few minutes of that, we want to open the discussion to the auditorium in general and invite your questions. So, Bettany, I'd like to begin by asking you where you think the Helen of this particular play stands against the larger background. There are a lot of Helens out there. She is such a popular and richly exploited character. What stands out for you about this particular take on her?
Well, there are indeed many Helens, as we all know. The book on Helen that I wrote took me 15 years to research. I've got a daughter in the audience, actually, and she will vouchsafe this. My children called it the treacherous book, because it meant I was locked up in a library somewhere or off, exploring, trying to find the true Helen, what Helen meant in the world. And the thing about Helen, as we know, is that there has not been a moment in human history from when she first appears 2,700 years ago, when she's left the human radar, which is extraordinary because civilizations have come and gone, and yet Helen has remained there as a constant. So there isn't a single decade in the human experience in both East and West where men and women have not had an opinion on Helen, have not created their own version of Helen. And I have to say, by the time I got to the end of writing this book, I did feel like saying, just leave her alone, please, this poor woman, just pick on somebody else, for heaven's sake. So on the most superficial face of it, and of course one has to dig much, much, much deeper, on the face of it, how lovely is this Helen that we're going to meet tonight, who is blameless, who is a good woman, who has just sat there quietly, suffering a little bit in Egypt while the Trojan War has been fought, all for a phantom, that it wasn't her fault at all. So I'd love to say that isn't it great that Euripides finally realised, having written many of his wonderful works, that actually he needed to be a bit kinder to women and he was going to put Helen up on this pedestal. But I'm sure, as everybody in this audience knows, that's not quite what happens in Euripides' Helen. I mean, it is a big question. Why did he write this play? Why did he choose to pick up on this aspect of her story? Is it the most marvellous joke? Helen, this terrible bitch whore, as she appears elsewhere, the nasty, scheming little bitch that she is in Homer and in other of the epic works, how could she possibly be without blame? It's obviously just a riotous laugh. So it could be that we're just joking about Helen. I think what's interesting in this particular version of Helen's story, though, are two things. One is the Egyptian connection. If you look at Helen's story, and you map it out, you make a literary map of where she appears in the world, where the authors of antiquity place her. And then you then put that over an actual map of the hotspots of antiquity, of the trade routes, of the cities that had a relationship with one another. The interesting thing is that they match almost perfectly. So when people are talking about Helen and her story and the extraordinary journeys that those heroes made over to Asia Minor, to Troy, then the Nostoi, the terrible homecoming, all these different places that they get washed up, actually what I think is being remembered, apart from anything else, apart from the gorgeous, sex and violence narrative that the Trojan War is, I think there's a kind of mental map of the connections of the ancient world, and the connection between mainland Greece and Egypt was immensely important and had been immensely important since the 15th century BC, so since the Bronze Age. So I like that about this. I like the fact that Egypt is given a role, in a way, in the Helen story. And I also like the fact that Euripides is obviously playing with these other versions of Helen that he'd have known of. Herodotus, of course, again, I'm sure you all know, Herodotus also says that he went to Egypt and he interviewed the priests, and they told him that Homer had got it completely wrong. Herodotus here is being very kind of marvellously kind of forensic and kind of journalistic about it. I know we all think Homer's great, but one has to look at the facts in front of one's face, and I've spoken to these Egyptian priests, and I know that Helen indeed went to Egypt. And this is what Herodotus actually says about why, of course, she would never have gone to Troy, and that whole story is just so wrong. Had Helen really been in Troy, she would have been handed over to the Greeks with or without Paris's consent. For I cannot believe that either Priam or any of the other kinsman of his was mad enough to be willing to risk his own and his children's lives and the safety of the city simply to let Paris continue to live with Helen. So he's saying all this love nonsense. Of course, Priam would not have been so daft. The fact is, they, the Trojans, did not give Helen up because they had not got her. What they told the Greeks was the truth. So Euripides is taking on these other versions of Helen. Stesichorus, the 6th century poet from Sicily, of course, is where this tale, as far as we know, originates. He wrote this great poem because he'd already written a very rude poem about Helen, as many of the ancient authors did. He'd written this very rude poem about Helen. The divine Helen had come and blinded him because she was so furious at this kind of slanderous version of her life, and realising his terrible mistake, then the poet had then penned the true version of the story of Helen, in which she is blameless and goes to Egypt. And so Euripides is I think, kind of just showing us really what a cultured man he is, and that he knows all these other versions of the Helen story. He's not just sticking to the kind of canon and the important Homeric version that would have circulated at the time.
Yes, we certainly get an innocent Helen, and that turns all sorts of things around, and particularly in contrast to the previous Euripidean Helen, if you think of Trojan women.
Yes.
But although she's an innocent Helen, she's not a Helen who feels herself to be guiltless, is she? In some way, the question of responsibility, the feelings of guilt cling to her. I mean, is this something that goes with Helen too, more generally?
I think it is, yes. I mean, you'd like to, if you looked at the kind of the versions of Helen that have been presented down time, you would think that she is just this cold-hearted femme fatale who enjoys the kind of awful discomfort that she's caused to so many men. But actually, exactly as you say, in all the versions from antiquity, Helen questions what is this thing that either her act or her non-act has caused. Is she actually responsible? Could it be that somehow she has encouraged by her actions all this suffering and strife? I'm just going to, I wasn't going to read you this, and I don't know if I've got it marked up. Oh, I will. This is something much later, 1938. We're travelling the centuries tonight, because we're going to have a marvellous 5th century moment at 7 o'clock. This is something that was written in 1938. And I really liked a little bit of doggerel, but I really like this because actually this gives Helen the kind of backbone that people have often wanted to have, where she does think she is completely guiltless. So this is what was said by Lord Dunsany in an interview in 1938. "And were you pleased, they asked of Helen in hell? Pleased, answered she, when all Troy's towers fell, and dead were Priam's sons and lost his throne, and such a war was fought as none had known, and even the gods took part, and all because of me alone? Pleased? I should say I was."
I suppose the other thing that the question of the other big Helen theme is Helen's beauty,
yes,
which also gets a particular spin from Euripides, because there's not just one Helen, there are two. Her beauty has somehow been both distanced from her but retained.
Yes.
Its effects are felt even where she isn't. Does this likewise play in with the larger picture of how Helen is used?
Definitely, and what's so interesting about Helen is that we all know her famously as the most beautiful woman in the world. That's her tagline, you know, the world's desire. We know that she had golden hair, this is what we're told, but actually, if you look again at all the accounts of Helen, it's not until the 4th century AD that we get any really specific description of her physical beauty. It's a man called Quintus of Smyrna who talks about her kind of indigo blue eyes and the length of her lashes and the particular brand of gold hair that she had. But up until that, actually, what men write about is not what Helen looked like, but what her appearance made men do. So they in fact leave her appearance absolutely open to the imagination, as of course you have to do, because the most beautiful woman in the world can only be beautiful as far as we, the viewer, consider her to be beautiful. I mean, you know, it's been the curse of painters down time. There's this, again, kind of famous story about Zeuxis, the Greek painter, who was given the very difficult task of painting an image of Helen for a temple. So this is really important. You know, he's having to paint Helen to honour the gods. And how does he do it? How do you capture absolute beauty? And the story goes that he decides what he's going to do is paint a kind of composite Helen. So he goes down to the gym, to the gymnasium, and he spots all the really pretty young boys. And he asks all the pretty boys to bring their sisters back to his studio so that he can audition them. So you can imagine, this is a fantastic story, and it's got a kind of that there's a thought that there is some kernel of truth in it, but actually what it really is a big story about the struggle of the artist in capturing the beauty of nature. Is this something that can be done? Anyway, so Zeuxis has got all these extremely attractive girls in his studio. And the 19th century, I'll go down to the Russell Coates Gallery in Bournemouth and you'll have a look. There's a wonderful series of 19th century paintings of Zeuxis auditioning these girls, which of course gives you the chance to have lots of women in a state of undress, you know, in these Victorian paintings. But what he tries to do is to take the nose of one, the shoulder of a second, the lips of a third, and somehow if he does this, he will manage to create the perfectly beautiful Helen. But of course, he's destined to fail in this task, and in all the artistic renditions of Zeuxis trying to paint Helen, there's another extraordinary, huge one in the Louvre, which you should go and see. The canvas, the central canvas, is always blank or unfinished because Zeuxis simply cannot do it. He cannot capture Helen's perfect beauty. So this was a kind of a morality tale that was told down time. But it is very interesting that, exactly as you said, we think of her as being ultimately beautiful, but actually, if you look very carefully at what's written about her, that's not talked about that much. What's talked about her is just the impact that she has on those around her. And, you know, as any of us know, the truth is, beauty doesn't affect people. Charisma, sexiness, you know, Cleopatra, we now know from the coins and all the debates and discussions, was probably quite ugly, in fact, but she had something, didn't she? She managed to control, well, well, she had a lot. She had a whole kind of kingdom, apart from anything else. But she did manage to manipulate the men around her, even though Cleopatra wasn't perfectly beautiful. And so I think, actually, the ancient authors are much more subtle than we think. You know, they're saying there's something even more dangerous than beauty. First of all, there's being female, which of course caused great anxiety to the ancients, and there's second is actually women who seem to be able to control men somehow. So it's not her physical face. Her breasts are talked about, as we all know, but people are fairly obsessed with Helen's breasts and the effect that they have on men. You know, Menelaus rushes in and finds...
But again, it's the effects, not the loving description.
No, exactly, that's right, that's absolutely right. Yeah, you know, sort of sees her chest and he's about to stab her, and then he goes, oh no, it's all right. You know,
bad idea.
Bad idea. 10 years of struggle, you know, countless deaths. Come back home, darling. You know. So yes, her beauty is you know, it's a very vexed question and an entirely fascinating one, but I think that we should remember what the ancients actually wrote about her physically.
I suppose one thing we perhaps have missed out so far in thinking about the play is the extent to which, unlike quite a lot of the accounts of Helen, uses of her, it tries to take you inside her feelings,
Yes.
her predicaments, stuck in Egypt, thinking that all her family is dead, knowing that she's hated for something she didn't do, but she can't change it. There's a constant series, isn't there, of invitations to see it from her point of view,
Yes.
which is something that a play can do more richly than an epic, for instance.
Yes, that's right. And I wonder if it comes, both at a time in the development of literary and intellectual discussions in Athens itself, when this was something which was actually possible. I mean, Michael is the expert on Socrates. He's very kind about my Socrates book, but actually, you're the man. But as you know, Plato and Socrates sort of play around with these ideas of women and what are women capable of, and are they simply the creatures to be feared? But no, probably not. There is something more going on. So I think actually he's being very of the moment, Euripides.
But it's certainly, she's a very capable Helen. If she didn't have the ideas she has in the course of the play,
Yes.
they wouldn't escape.
Yes. Yeah.
And Menelaus can only recover his self-respect and act heroically because he's been told
Yes.
how to behave. So there's some quite careful balancing out of the power relations and responsibilities there, isn't there?
There is indeed. I mean, actually, again, if you read Homer carefully, she's quite resourceful in Homer as well. I mean, this is why I don't know if any of you admits to having seen the film Troy. I have as well. It's all right. We've all seen it. Well, I mean, we can talk about that afterwards. But I have to say, and I'm not being indiscreet here, oh my goodness, how I hated that portrayal of Helen in that film, who was everything. Again, if you'd said to the ancients, this is Helen, they'd have gone, no, it's not, that's some other character. Because the fact that she was in that film, this sort of spineless, weeping beauty who would dissolve into tears, at the least instance, and sort of, drooping onto Paris was just, oh my God, I couldn't bear it. It was just so completely awful. But exactly as you say, actually in this Helen that we're about to see, and again in moments in Homer, she has real strength of character. I mean, that's why she's so scary, I think, because she's not just a woman, she's not just beautiful, she's not just a queen, she's not just powerful. Actually, she looks like there's a brain inside that pretty head. The thing that we that I think is very interesting in the interplay again of this Helen and of the other Euripidean Helens and the other Helens of Greek drama is, of course, that she is, as we all know, she's a Spartan girl. And when this was performed, Athens was starting to do really, really badly in its conflict with Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. There'd been a moment when things had looked like the Athenians were just going to power through. It was our Iraq moment. There was a moment when it looked like, of course, the Athenians were going to win, and then suddenly this horrible realization that wasn't the case. The terrible atrocities on Milos had happened just a few years before. Again, if you know your Thucydides and your Greek history, which I'm sure most of you do, this decision to go because the Melians weren't going to concede to Athenian demands, and so the entire male population probably was slaughtered and the women and children enslaved. And the Athenians were very troubled by this. I think, this was something that they talked about in the Agora, is something which is obviously dealt with in the previous play, in the Trojan Women. And so this is a time when it's absolutely to the fore of everybody's minds, what do we do about this Spartan problem, which is causing us to act in such a barbaric way? And I think these conversations did actually go on. And Helen is a Spartan girl, so she is the enemy. She's female and she's Athens' arch enemy. So she's got this kind of pumped up, hyped up threat.
But that makes some parts of Euripides' handling all the more striking, doesn't it? Because it's a key part of the situation that Helen is an exile. She's thinking desperately of home.
Yes.
We're on her side, so we feel for her feelings of nostalgia and separation and loss. But what are those focused on? Sparta, girls dancing by the Eurotas.
Yes.
And when you get this great burst of joy when you realise that they are going to get away with it, they're going to escape, they are going home, across the sea, past the dancing dolphins and all that,
Yes.
to Sparta. And yet all this is being paraded before an Athenian audience.
Yes.
I mean, how do you read that?
Well, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinarily sympathetic. I mean, Euripides, I am, I'm sure most people are in this room, but genius is a word that's overused, and I think you can apply it to Euripides. I think the kind of subtlety of his thought and of his composition is quite extraordinary. And I wonder if at this point, because there would have been so many prisoners, female prisoners of war, who've come into Athens by now. I mean, when we know that tens of thousands of men were killed, that does mean that there's a kind of corollary of tens of thousands of women and children who are going to have been brought in to the city as slaves, as prisoners of war. And whether in some way he is giving them their narrative. I think also there is this sort of, this kind of fantasy version of the Spartan girl and the Spartan woman, because Helen was worshipped in Sparta. She was adored. There's this, and there will be, and certainly until I die and probably beyond, this big academic debate about what Helen is being worshipped in Sparta. Is it a kind of early vegetation goddess, or is it actually the heroine? How much is there a conflation between the adoration of the heroic Helen and of this kind of nature divinity? But I think actually the Spartans conflated the two. I think they allowed the two to complement one another. And the worship of Helen in Sparta is really vigorous. I mean, it's something which has been underplayed in academia until recently. But if you go there, Sparta's great. Go there if you haven't gone. It's the most fantastic place to visit. And go up to the Menelaon. Again, has anybody done that? Has anybody gone up there? Yes, okay. I hope you agree with me, a very atmospheric place. It's one of those places where you go and you can be in two times at once, I think. Because there you have the mountain range above you, you have the Eurotas Valley with the river winding through it. You can see why the Spartans thought that they had managed to own this almost kind of Shangri-La, this sort of in Greece, which is not generally flat and fertile. They had this flat, fertile land, and you really get that sense. And in this little river spur called Therapne, little hill, it's quite hard to find, because I think there's only one very battered sign to it, so ask a local in Sparta before you get out, otherwise you'll end up driving back to Corinth, which is not a good idea. So you just sort of kind of go towards Corinth, and after about 5 kilometres turn right, basically, up this little hill. And this is where Helen and Menelaus were worshipped, at the Menelaon. Brilliant excavations there have shown that actually there's a Bronze Age temple site underneath. And Helen was worshipped very, very vigorously here. We've got the meat hooks on which sacrifices to her were hung, and the meat hooks are inscribed with her name, Eleni. Beautiful, beautiful little metal perfume bottles, again left as an offering, inscribed with her name. Young women would come up here to honour Helen. Young girls would race in her honour by the banks of the Eurotas. And because they raced, and possibly because they raced naked, there has already, by the 5th century, become this rather sort of salacious version of what goes on in the worship of Helen. It gets worse and worse and worse. I have to say, there's a chapter in this book, I think it's chapter 16, which I find has been thumbed by my husband rather too many times. There's all these sort of descriptions of these gorgeous Spartan girls oiling each other in olive oil. There's one Roman source says that they're nipple-shaped cakes, which is just obviously total fantasy. But even by the 5th century, there is this kind of notion of what it is to be a Spartan girl, this kind of excited idea of who they are. So again, as you say...
All that is what Euripides' Helen is going back to. That's the drawing.
Exactly, yes, exactly.
As far as Euripides is concerned, I wonder if there isn't also an element of escapist fantasy, the idea that you can survive a war.
Yes.
It can finally be passed and laid to rest, and you're back home,
yes.
Which is what's happening to Helen. And parading that with a Spartan heroine before an Athenian audience may be saying something about what they might be able to hope for in the longer term in their own.
I think that's so true and astute, and you wouldn't do it with an Athenian heroine or hero, because that would be hubristic to do that. But somehow you can do it by transposing it to the Spartan story. No, that's right.
It will eventually be possible to identify with the people who are now our enemies.
Yes.
That kind of
idea, absolutely, no, absolutely. So it's a very charged. I mean, I've got no idea what this production, how it's going to. Are we going to have a comedy? Are we going to have a tragedy? I don't know. I really don't know. So it'll be very interesting to see. But I think whatever we're going to see, when you watch it, you do have to think yourself back 24, 25 centuries, back to the moment of its production, when it was put on as part of a religious festival, where the men who went to watch it would have been drinking all night before they came to see it, so sitting there with a rather sore head, but still again kind of knowing that they were watching something very special. Probably 50% of the mandated citizens of Athens would be sitting in that auditorium watching this show, having suffered appallingly as a result of the Peloponnesian War, you know, having watched their mothers and grandmothers and fathers and uncles first of all die horrifically in the plague, which raged through Athens, killing 80,000, and then watching it as in effect, you know, their young male population came home in body bags, and now this awful truth that actually this is a war that they're just about hanging on by their fingertips, you know, and keeping some kind of an upper hand. And all of this, so just imagine all of this has been going on, and now you're going to be sitting on your seats under that hot Mediterranean sun, the hot neon lights, and having played out in front of you a counterintuitive story about your arch enemy, Helen, this Spartan woman.
I think on that note, it's probably time that we opened up
Yes.
to questions from the auditorium. And Bettany, it's probably easiest if you identify
Yes,
the ones that you...
absolutely. And please do ask me. Well, I was going to say anything. Actually, don't. I probably won't answer anything. But anything you want. And we should talk about Helen perhaps now, or just the classics generally if you want to. I am going to be outside after the performance as well. So
there are books. There are. But if you're shy and want to ask me questions, then do come and grab me. But yes, anything at all about the classics. But perhaps we could kick off with one on Helen. Does anybody have a question or a challenge? Yes, lady in the middle.
Hello. I was wondering, in Greek literature, Helen's often referred to as both daughter of a divinity
Yes.
and a god, and of mortal. How do you think Euripides sort of reconciles the two in this play?
Yeah, well, I think that. So the question, I'm sure you heard it, is she's whose daughter is Helen? Basically, is she half divine? We all know that. She does have this slightly odd start to life, according to most accounts, in that she was born from an egg, because her father was Zeus. Zeus, the story goes that Zeus espied her mother, the Queen of Sparta, Leda, washing herself down on the banks of the river Eurotas, and was so enraptured by her, he had to have her, so he turned himself into a giant swan and raped her. Zeus can never keep it in his trousers, can he?
Even when he's a swan.
Even when he's a swan. It's so true. But I'm sorry to be crude, but swans have extraordinary penises. I don't know if you know. That's why I only know this from my Helen study. So this is where would we start? So this is a scene that was replicated a lot on tombstones. Interestingly, very, very, very popular on tombstones to have this image of Leda being raped by a swan. Odd. I still can't quite get my head why you would like to be commemorated by that particular image. So who is Helen? Is she the daughter of a god, or is she somebody very mortal? She's got, what's interesting about her here, as Michael says, she's very canny. She sorts out what they need to do, and she seems to have the luck of the gods on her side. So I think that Euripides is being very 5th century about this, because we have to mind shift. We have to put ourselves back into Athenian heads, where for them, gods and demigods and spirits were around every corner. There was nothing peculiar about the idea that people had some kind of divine gene in them. That really was not. It wasn't odd. It wasn't just, they weren't dealing with this just as a kind of metaphorical notion. They really believed it. So I think that partly Helen's success here comes from the fact that she is a little bit more than a mere mortal, a little bit more than a human.
But it's another of the things that upsets her.
Yes.
If it wasn't bad enough being stuck here in Egypt, I've got this implausible ancestry.
Yes,
to deal
yes,
with as well.
yes, yeah, absolutely, exactly. It's very funny. Exactly right. I know it's a very funny line. No, she does have great lines in history. I mean, I think we sort of think of Helen as a victim, but you know, she's not really. If you look at her, she's such a survivor. I mean, we last hear of her in Homer. She's caused all this trouble. I mean, the known world has followed in her wake. All these men have died, and yet she's left in Homer, back in Sparta, in charge of her palace, gently leading Menelaus back up to their bedchamber. You know, that's a woman who's won at the end. It's certainly not somebody who's been crushed by her own life story. Any other questions? Yes, gentleman over there.
What's the relevance, please, of the song of Demeter and Persephone to the story of Helen in the play?
I can't answer that. I don't know if you can, Michael.
Not confidently, no. It fits a mood at the very least, that it is a song about loss, separation, moments of desperation, which are eventually going to be healed. And a lot of the story that we see played out for Helen in the play is a story of that kind. So there's that kind of thematic fit, or fit of mood, at least.
I know what there is, interestingly, and I think this might be one of these extraordinary fragments that's going to appear from the Oxyrhynchus papyri, that there's a suggestion that Euripides actually wrote a full play that looked at that theme of Demeter and Persephone and how it related to the Helen story. So it's obviously something that he's very interested in, the parallels between the two. And I wonder if almost this is him testing out, you know, doing a little kind of pilot run, as it were, for the bigger work. So it would be wonderful if more of that work appears. And I think there's a possibility that somebody thinks they might have found a fragment of a line of it in the Oxyrhynchus papyri in Oxford. So come back in 10 years' time, we might be able to answer the question more fully. There was somebody up here who gentleman at the back, and then you, lady in the middle, yeah.
What was the Spartan attitude to Clytemnestra?
Yes, well, she's not worshipped. So, very, very interesting that. And I think there's almost this kind of polarity that happens in family relationships, that you have, as we all know, people in families get labelled the good one and the bad one. And definitely, today in Sparta, if you go to Sparta today and sit round in the Caffeneon and the cafes where the men sit and have their coffees and their cigarettes still, they still debate to this day whether Helen was a slut, whether she was an abused woman, whether she's a good role model for their Spartan women, or whether actually she's somebody who should be disgraced in the city. So she's absolutely still a living, you know, a really important fixture in modern Spartan culture. But Clytemnestra doesn't get a look in. There's a DVD that's been produced, it's sort of tourist DVD, a guide to Sparta, and it's all narrated by Helen. And there's a very interesting line in which she says, "I was born alone." So even in that, Clytemnestra's been kind of scratched out from the record. So no, Clytemnestra does not get any shrines. Girls don't run races in her honour. But I think, you know, again, that's what's fascinating about that is what, you know, Clytemnestra is so guilty, is so palpably guilty. Whereas with Helen, there is always this question: is she guilty? Was it Aphrodite who led her? Was she entirely blameless, as Michael says? And there's enough of a question mark over her story to allow people to be very excited at the idea of worshipping her. Lady, yes.
I'm really interested in like the portrayal of women in like lots of like Euripides plays. What was it that inspired you to like write about Helen? What interested you the most about her?
Well, it was very kind of simple. Two things actually inspired me to write about Helen. One was going to the Menelaon, going to the shrine site in Sparta, and just standing there for a whole afternoon. This beautiful, as I said, do go. I'm not paid by the Greek Tourist Board, by the way, but you know, it is the most it is quite a magical, but it is quite charmed in a way. You stand up there and you have this kind of warm wind buffeting around you. It's a perfect religious site, and as I said, the excavations show us that there was not just a civic building, but a temple building there from at least the 14th century onwards. So it's a kind of real prime spot for being close to your gods, to being close to the spirit world. And the Spartans could have chosen to worship anybody up there. They could have chosen to worship Zeus or their great hero Heracles or Hera, but they don't. They choose to put Helen up there in that prime spot. And I remember standing there, and this is a very unacademic answer to your question. It's a very emotional one in a way, but I do remember the moment when I stood there and I thought, well, I've been told so often that Helen is just a pretty face, but standing here now thinking of those legions of Spartans who've come up to pay honour to her, there must be more to her story. So that was actually what set me off on the journey. And also, she is a great character because she's travelled, as I said, right through time, over close on 3 millennia. And it's so difficult for us to find stories of women in history. It's almost as if she sort of holds your hand and takes you through, if not the female story, the story of the attitude to women through time. And it is a bit depressing. I'd love to say it's great, you know. Actually, there are these glorious moments where Helen is honoured as she was in Sparta, but that is pretty much a blip. You know, generally she is the bitch whore that she was throughout much of 5th century drama. Yes, gentleman at the front here.
Yeah, we're all currently studying Agamemnon, the Aeneid.
Yeah.
I was just wondering about there's this curse upon the house of Atreus.
Yes.
I was wondering, is Helen's leaving of Menelaus part? Could you interpret that as part of the curse? Do you think, or does that manifest in any way upon Menelaus?
Well, yes. So the fact that this is a family that has issues, and what greater issue could you have other than this powerful, rich queen who's been won, as she should be, with the contests of the heroes. Menelaus has got the kingdom of Sparta through Helen, and it looks as though it's going to be perfect for a moment, and then it all goes as horribly wrong as it possibly could do. I think what I think actually is being talked about in Aeschylus and Euripides, in all the narratives of Helen, is a very deep-seated Greek fear of what happens when Xenia is perverted. Xenia, again, I'm sure you all know, Xenia is the guest host friendship that you find in Homer. Interestingly, that you find earlier, actually, on Linear B tablets, so the very kind of earliest form of Greek, there's a thing called Kessenewia, sort of Zenioia, if you're going to transliterate it. So right at the beginning of civilization, as we know it, the Greeks have this very strong idea that actually how you work as a society is by making friends with those just beyond your borders, beyond your boundaries, just beyond your horizons. And there's going to be this kind of code of behaviour that stitches the Mediterranean together. And Paris's rape, abduction of Helen absolutely flies in the face of that code of understanding. So I think, as well as the curse of the House of Atreus, actually in kind of geopolitical terms, that's being brought to the fore of proof. This is what happens when that code of Xenia goes really horribly wrong.
Thinking of the women, I mean, it's certainly possible to take a position that assimilates, that brings Helen and Clytemnestra together, because there's the line of Stesichorus, that these were the women who married twice and thrice and did their husbands in.
Yes.
And that's a formula that you, in one version or another, will fit both of them.
Yes, absolutely. No, that's absolutely right. I just lady at the front here.
Ever since I saw a Dr. Faustus and Marlowe,
yes,
in which Helen was depicted really as the whole attraction of the ancient Greek world, the genius of it, in competition with Christianity. I can't think of it as otherwise, and I would say that the size of this audience testifies to the power of attraction of the ancient Greek world, and that it can be embodied, it can be seen embodied in Helen.
Yes, I think that's very true, and I'd like to. That's a very beautiful thought. and I'm about to puncture it with something very crude, but it actually is completely relevant. That after I'd done this thing, we made a television programme about Helen, which is a story in itself, I have to say, and it's completely indiscreet to me, but I remember the television producer saying, great, Helen, fantastic. What I think we should do is we should rebuild the Trojan horse. and it took me, it was just awful. It took me about 4 weeks, and the producer had produced Blue Peter, and I thought, no, this is him. Exactly, terrible moment. We managed to sort of swerve ourselves away from that. But because we didn't build the Trojan horse, the sort of, consolation prize for him was that he said, oh, okay, can't do the Trojan horse. But you know what, that's great. If you want to look at the Bronze Age roots of this story, there are fantastic representations of chariots from the Bronze Age. What I want to do is I want to make a Hittite-style chariot and a Mycenaean Greek-style chariot and put them back on the plains of Troy. And so I kind of thought, oh, God, my academic reputation in tatters, this is a disaster. I can see the headlines, Blue Peter meets ancient Greece. So I said, okay, well, listen, we haven't got the Trojan horse, so we will have the chariots, but on the strict understanding that this is an archaeological experiment, so that we only make it with materials available at the time. And it was actually fascinating, because the Hittite chariots turned out to be like these sort of tanks, whereas the Greek chariots were incredibly light and nippy. They were great. Unfortunately, I think it is on YouTube, this sequence, so you can see them in action. But we got to Troy with these incredibly expensive, beautifully researched chariots, and I was meant to start filming at 5 o'clock in the morning. I had a rat on the door from the producer, and he said, I've forgotten to book any bloody horses. So we had chariots and no horses. And our assistant producer, who was a classicist, of course, ever resourceful, had been a head girl, I think, said, right, I've got to sort this out. I've seen some gypsies, some Romany folk on the plains of Troy, because I don't know, again, if you've been there, it's now agricultural, so they grow tomatoes and cotton there, and you get this itinerant labour in. Every season to pick them. It's gypsies from the kind of borders of Turkey and Iraq. Where there are gypsies, there are horses. I'm going to go down and see if I can borrow the gypsies' horses. She marched off down to this gypsy camp at the dawn, found herself a translator from somewhere. And of course the gypsies, being great gypsies, had no intention of lending us their horses, but saw we were in a fix and hired us their horses at a quite spectacular exhort. I think they're about sort of €2,000 per horse for these kind of clapped out old nags that normally pull tomatoes across the plains of Troy. But we were desperate, so we hitched these horses up to our chariots, to our Hittite. And there is a point that Helen does come into this. Sorry, I haven't gone mad. Chariots, and put them onto the plains of Troy, and had kind of great fun. And at the end, and the gypsies ended up being in the film. They were the Trojan spear carriers, so it was all kind of very beautiful. And at the end of the film, we thought, to be honest, partly so that they felt very involved and to be polite, that we'd interview them. So we sort of had a lovely fire, and we sat around the fire, and I said in my best tele-interviewing voice, sort of, so, the Trojan War, you've come to this area since time immemorial. What do you think? Do you tell each other stories of the Trojan War and the Iliad and Homer? Total blank. I mean, complete. They didn't know the place that they came to was called Troy. It was one of those very embarrassing, just absolute silence. So sort of cameras turning all the time. So sort of slightly scrabbling around. I said, okay, right. Well, Achilles, I know that you are very heroic in your culture, and Achilles is this great macho warrior. And this was when Troy had just come out in Turkey, so Achilles in his leather miniskirt was in all the bus stops. So I thought, well, at least they'll know who Achilles is. So it's Achilles. Again, total blank. They had no idea what I was talking about. So then I said, well, Helen, any ideas on Helen of Troy? And immediately their thumbs went up like this, and one of the men made this gesture with that at the end. And it was an extraordinary moment, because there I was talking to a group of illiterate nomadic gypsies from the Turkey-Iraq border who didn't know who Homer was, who didn't know about the Trojan War, but they knew about Helen. They had a fixed and a firm idea of what she meant to them. So it really just drove home to me, poor old Helen, look what she's become. And luckily, I think it's now time, isn't it? Euripides is going to give her a kind of better crack
with
at the
that
whip.
sinuous hand gesture, I think we can't improve. Before we thank Bettany warmly for this marvellous display of Hellenic wisdom, knowledge. The director of the play, Adam Gibb, would like to say a few words.
Yes, okay. I'm sure I'm not alone when I say how grateful everyone is for both Professor Trapp and Bettany Hughes for coming today. It's certainly given myself food for thought, and I'm sure it's given everybody else food for thought as you watch my production of Euripides' Helen. Yes, it's been a fantastic introduction, and just as a token of Greek plays, thanks to both of you, we brought you both a bottle of wine.
Oh,
Thank you ever so
you.
much.
How kind.
Well.
Ferris, great wine. I'd like to share it all, but I
Thank you ever so much.